Good morning, Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are at the bottom of page 1472. Okay. The paragraph we learned yesterday, the previous class, is B'chol Hanal. With all the above, we will understand the idea, the inyan of the two Yichudim, namely Yichud law, the higher unity, and Yichud Tato, the lower unity, which are indicated in Shema and Baruch Shem Kved Machusei Leilam Vod, or in Shema itself, and more specifically, in Shema itself, Hashem Elokeinu and Hashem Echad. And this, in turn, allows us to reach the level of Ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, to love God b'chol levavcha, b'shnei tzurecha, that also the animal soul can be harnessed and become fuel, oil, for the divine light and the divine love. So he explained it with the pasuk. Ki kel deis havai v'lei niskanu aliles. That God consists of deis. He's all-knowing. But deis is lashon rabbim. Two deis, das elyon and das tachten. V'lei niskanu aliles. So the loy is written with an aleph, but pronounced with a vav. So he explains the 2 days, das elyon and das tachten. That, and when you say that kel deis havai, that God's sevel, he contains, basically unites both levels, both aware, both perspectives. The perspective from above, the perspective from below. What are these two perspectives? So he explained it with what we learned earlier, that the ha'ara and the ohr, that all of existence comes through ohr. That's why it doesn't affect the etzem. And that ohr itself, there are two levels in general. The ohr, as is called batzmuseh, the koyach esgalus, the power of atzmus, the power of the source to reveal himself. That is connected to das elyon, where above it's yesh, the yesh amiti, and from there comes an ayin ohr, and all of existence is kala chashiv, like he says, kula kamei kala, like nothingness. It's all batel b'mitzias. So the ohr senses that higher level of ohr. The lower perspective is the ohr that manifests and relates to existence. And like he says, in a form of that it relates to, and it's bislapshus. So it's a derech kiruv. Bizgalus lahavish, it becomes kiruv elayesh, and in the form of islapshus, kayach apel benifel, the power of the producer in the product. And he says, from the example of the nefesh and the guf, it's mukhrach. From the mashal of the ohr v'chayis, the energy and the vitality of the soul and the body, that there are two levels. There's the level of the soul, like he says, that is affected by the experiences of the body. That's the lower level. And then the opposite, there's the etzem nefesh, that even the koyach is galus in the nefesh, which earlier he called gashmi sheberuchnis, but the etzem nefesh, and even his power to reveal, similar to the power to reveal in the Lamaila and Elakus, Einim Ispol is not affected at all. And it comes b'meila without shini v'ispailus. It automatically flows from the soul without any effect and any impact, any change. So those are the two levels. And that's the dugma Lamaila, that we have these two levels. And on this we say, Ein b'zeh shum shini shal zen nemar ani Hashem le'shanisi. That's the higher level. And the other, the way it comes, bizgalus lahaves, kayachapel benifel, that's in the form of kiruv. So even though, like in parentheses, he qualifies that there too, be'emes lo yeshum shinui klal, there's no change there at all. And I just want to add, what's he emphasizing be'emes? Because remember, he did say that there could be a shinui mitzad the hislapshus, but not mitzad the etzem. So in other words, there is a level of shinui on a lower level, as we learned it. But be'emes, that ohr also, even the ohr malchus, as it comes, there's no shinui. But, so what distinguishes it from the higher level of ohr that's encompassed in the etzem? That is b'chinas kiruv elayesh. Okay. So these are the two levels, das Ayin and das Tachten, two levels of bittul. The bittul of kula kamei kalachash, of everything is like nothingness. Ayin compared to the yesh amiti. And the second level of bittul is bittul hayesh. There is a yesh, and the yesh, in other words, it's not that the yesh is lamaila and the ayin lamata. The yesh is lamata, and the ayin is lamaila, and there's the bittul hayesh to the ayin. That's going from the bottom up, das tacht, how das tachten sees it. And he compared it now also to the sun. So there's the sunlight within the sun, and then there's the sunlight outside of the sun. Inside the sun, it's completely bottled. Like he brought from Shar Yichud V'Amunah, from Tanya. And the same thing with the energy that comes from the soul. Okay, yeah. Yesh la'ayin, the tas tachten is ma'ayin l'yesh. Then we have the two. And this is also the loy. You say loy niskenu aliles. The loy with an aleph indicates on the oir that manifests within existence. The loy with an aleph, the way it's written, indicates on the oir that's loy, kala, completely bottled. And then the final thing he said, which I said needs more explanation, is das tachten. As you remember, I asked a few questions what that means exactly. So I will comment on that right now. Give it some more thought. So ostensibly you could say, let me just repeat the discussion, what was going on here. Then das Ayin says, Ein Negei Klal. What's Ein Negei? It means there's no shinei at all, no yispalus, nothing is affected. And that's why it's loy with an aleph. In loy with a vav, there's negei ma'aser tachten. So I asked the question, didn't he say earlier that when it comes to Isavus, even in the loy even in the elikus, the ha'ara that comes into existence, there's also no shinui. So why is he saying it's negei ma'aser tachten? So ostensibly you could say ma'aser tachten maybe means that because he's coming away from kiruv, he's close to the connection, relating to the yesh, like we said. So it may not be a shinui, but it's negeya, it relates to it. You can also say maybe he's referring to the kelim of Asiyah, where he said earlier that there is a shinui v'ispalis in the end of the paragraph on page 1471. However, from the word ma'aser tachtenim, it doesn't sound like he's talking about creation. Because earlier he used that expression, ma'aser tachtenim, on Aveda, the second track. The ma'aser tachtenim is negei, like he said in the parentheses on the bottom of page 1471, the second half. He said very clearly, he said, Zeis vadesh habegam negei b'chinas hamalchus, and he talks about how both our mitzvahs and also our transgressions affect l'mayla, but that's avodah, not his savos. The fact that he uses ma'aser tachtenim sounds like the avodah part, even though, as I said, b'deichik, you could. If you force it, you could say it doesn't mean the same ma'aser tachtenim that he meant a page before. However, that doesn't resonate with me. Something not right. It doesn't sound right. So then let's go a little deeper. So what does he mean then? So perhaps he's saying like this, that in addition to the hisavos, where it is a kiruv el hayesh, though it doesn't have impact and shinui, there's another thing. We did learn earlier that ma'aser tachtenim, which means what we do below, affects malchus. And it said clearly it does not affect higher than malchus. It doesn't affect higher than malchus. The only thing is, malchus is like the potter's wheel. So once you open up that channel, energy from higher levels will flow downward. And in that sense, it affects it. But it doesn't affect it directly. It's like you open up the door, so then things enter through the door. That which enters is not directly impacted by our avodah. This was explained at length on page 1429 and referred to on the previous page, 1471. But so you could say that ma'aser tachtenim itself has two aspects: how it affects the lower level, that's the loy with an vav. How, in other words, the elikus that connects and relates to existence, and then the levels of elikus higher than existence, ma'aser tachtenim affects indirectly by allowing that to flow downward. However, there's still one thing that needs to be clarified, because he did say that ma'aser tachtenim affects pnimius Ein Sof, he said, not just Malchus. I'm just reading inside here. He said, Pnimius Tzenius Baruch. So Chitzenius Hamakiv is Chashecha Ke'era, darkness is like light. That's an equalizer. But Pnimius Tzenius is mitzvahs. And then again, he said that Pnimius Ein-Sof, there tshuva helps. It reaches there. So how does that correspond with Ma'aseh Tachtenim affecting only the lower level? So here again, he doesn't say there it's negeya and touches and changes Pnimius. It says it affects it. What does it mean by affects it? Let's talk about what means affects. It means that could be that you're allowing it to flow. That's the effect, like he explained on page 1429. So in other words, the Ma'aseh Tachtenim have two aspects, how they affect Malchus and affect Elikus, Das Tachten basically, and how they affect Das Elyon more indirectly. And what he means by Pnimius Utzene and Tshuva reaches there because Tshuva is able to reach. But that doesn't mean it creates change. It means it's able to access it. Accessing and change is not necessarily the same thing. Now, one more point I want to add to this. Back in Vayikra and Sav Ayin Hey, in volume 2, he discussed at length relatively whether our Aveda Tzedek Geveya, whether our Aveda affects the high, what level does our Aveda reach? And he asked all these questions there. In Atzilus, you can't say that Aveda changes anything. So what does it mean? So he explained that Atzilus chose to be impacted by it. So you go there, he explains the concept even in a more subtle and a more powerful way. Well, I would say more powerful and more subtle levels, where he explains the two sides to it, that it's not that God has changed, but God chooses to engage, and therefore he wants the Tachtenim to affect him, so to speak. But that's not a contradiction to Leishanisi, because Leishanisi really means that Atzilus is immutable. Immutable does not mean that God cannot choose to engage with his creation. It's a taiva, it's higher than logic, but he did desire that. So one way or another, there is some relationship to that level. However, you would have to say, as he explained earlier, that the real changes happen on lower levels, but the access does happen to higher levels. That's how I would explain all of this, and that's why he's bringing Ma'aseh Tachtenim into this picture. Okay. With that, we concluded paragraph at the bottom of page 1472, and I shall be ready to continue unless somebody has a question on what I just discussed.
Rabbi Jacob, in the previous volumes, there was a discussion of Ohr and Keli, and it was saying that when the Ohr comes into the Keli at different levels, there is a concept of the Keli refining the Ohr and shining it back to its source. So you're not changing, as you said. Of course, that's not change, but that can also be applied here, no?
Well, that can be. Why not? Because Ohr and Keli is the lower level. The Ohr relates to the Keli.
But it was saying that the Keli wants to
that's the lower level. He says that explicitly here.
Yeah.
That it's kiruv elayesh. So there's a relationship between the Ohr and the Keli. That's how the divine energy manifests and exists. That's koyach hapoel benifel is essentially mean Ohr and Keli. Okay. That's different words for it, but this is essentially the same idea.
Okay.
The question is not about that. The question is about the Ohr that's higher than Keli, that does not manifest in the Keli. How is that related? How is that impact?
The prior discussion in volume 2 that you referred to, I think you said it, but that related to the Inyan of Tshuva, correct?
Not necessarily.
No?
Generally, avodah. That our avodah, what level our avodah impacts.
Mm-hmm. But
I don't even
can
think
you,
if I recall correctly.
Do you know a page number roughly where I can go back and look at that?
Vayikra and Sav Tafresh Ayin Hey. I don't have the pages in front. I don't have the book in front of me.
Okay.
Vayikra and Sav Tafresh Ayin Hey.
Thank you.
Okay. I may have marked it up on my page here. Let me see. I may have marked it here. I don't know. Let me see. No, I don't see it. I should have marked it. Why didn't I mark it? Interesting.
I'll go look for it. If I can find it, I'll post it, Bli Neder.
Okay, so let's continue learning now. On the bottom of page 1472, the new paragraph, which can be found if you want to follow the text at ayinbeis.com. V'hine, and now, b'chdei sha'ayin shel hayesh yeh b'chinas kiruv el hayesh. Now, the lower level, we're talking about the ayin of the yesh. So, ayin here is referring to Ohr. That's completely bottled. That it should become b'kiruv el hayesh. Remember, we said that the ayin, the Ohr itself on its own is not related to existence. That's the divine energy. That's the God's power to express himself. That doesn't mean he's yet relating to existence. We learned at length earlier, a number of times, that there's a Ohr legalis la'atzmei. Even the Ohr before the tzimtzum, it's Ohr, but it's to himself. It's just his power of expression. Here he's talking even Ohr hakol batzmusei. Then there's a Ohr legalis la'atzmei. Then there's a Ohr hashayach la'elamis, where God begins to envision and ultimately allocate resources and envision the resources needed to create. So, before the tzimtzum itself, we learned that these are the levels, subtle levels, which he's referring to here as the two general levels of the ayin of the yesh amiti, and then there's the ayin of the yesh anivra. So he's saying, for this ayin of the yesh to become a kiruv el hayesh, kiruv means that it's associating with it. Like we said, yehi Ohr, yehi rakia. That's already the divine spelling out, actually speaking words. And the word yehi Ohr is a different word than yehi rakia. It's not just God saying, let there be a world. It's actual, specific, tailored, customized language to each creation. So it's bechinas kiruv yesh lahaviz bechinas hayesh v'ametzias. In order to create yesh metzias, the substance and an existence, so you need that kiruv, applying himself, not from a distance, but applying himself, like an artist applies the easel to the canvas. So he's applying himself in creating. The besharshe, in its root, bechinas ha'ayin hakol ba'etzem hu muvdal mezeh legamdi canal. In its root, the ayin, which is encompassed in the etzem, which is more the Ohr, which is from the divine perspective, God's so-called power to reveal himself. There is completely removed from associating kiruv el hayesh. You can't call it kiruv el hayesh. You can only say that God is now priming himself, so to speak. He's created a level of light that is going to express himself. Then there's a level of light that associates with and relates to and engages with existence. So it's muvdal canal, as we learned earlier. Hinezeu. So how does this happen? How does Ohr, that he didn't explain, at least till now. I mean, he explained it earlier, as you'll soon see. How does it happen that an Ohr that is completely removed from existence, because it's still, all it is God's infinite expression. How does that become an Ohr that's kiruv el hayesh? As I said yesterday, this doesn't happen magically. God doesn't want to use kol yachol, that he can do whatever he wants. He wants everything to make sense, that this should make sense how one level goes to the next level. So here we have the introduction of the Parsa, or as it's known in the highest levels, the tzimtzum. So he says, Hine zehu, aydem tsoyes ha-parsa amavsekes beineim. Top of page 1473. This is due to the interface of the partition or the curtain that separates between these two levels, the Ohr Kolabatz Musa and the Ohr that goes B'Kiruv Elayesh. So in other words, if you didn't have a Parsa, what would make the Ohr suddenly be diminished to fit into, let's call it the containers. I don't want to use the word containers here. He hasn't used kalim, but to fit into and be commensurate to existence. What? So again, you could say God can do anything, but he wants it to be logical. So this is already the process of the Parsa. Now you may wonder, why doesn't he say Tzimtzum? Tzimtzum Arishan. Isn't that the role of the Tzimtzum Arishan? It's exactly what the role. The Tzimtzum Arishan, the Ohr Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum was removed, and worlds could not exist. There could be no independent consciousness. And then the Tzimtzum allows for independent consciousness. Why does he use Parsa? So, two reasons I would say. Firstly, because he's talking here more Atzilus to Biy'a. And there we use Parsa, not Tzimtzum. Even though B'chlolos, in the macrocosm, Atzilus the Klolos, Atzilus in macrocosm, for it to move to Biy'a of macrocosm, is the Tzimtzum Arishan. But here he's speaking primarily in the level of Atzilus to Biy'a, which is, we're talking Koyach HaPoel Benifel. That's already the divine energy that manifests, like we said, Malchus, that's going into Biy'a. And then there's Malchus, how it's an Atzilus, and the spheres higher than that remain removed and remain apart. So the Parsa is the separator between those. Another point I would make, even though it's not really the main answer to my question, is that Parsa, generally speaking, means partition. That's what it means. You could interchange Parsa and Tzimtzum, even though you're not going to usually do, Chassidus doesn't usually do that. Parsa is usually used after Atzilus, or even the Parsa is higher than Atzilus, like we learned in volume 2 at length. Usually Parsa is in many ways stronger than Tzimtzum. Sometimes it's weaker than the Tzimtzum. So, but nevertheless, you could say the word Parsa in a very broad sense means partition. And that partition applies, like we learned in volume 2, to all levels, Parsois. I don't want to stick with that because Parsa and Tzimtzum Arishan, I don't know that I've ever seen that those are interchangeable. They're probably not. So that's what I'm being careful. But the main explanation is the first one that I just gave. Okay. And he gives an example for this Parsa. Remember, the operative examples that we'll be learning here is light, sun and sunlight, and nefesh and nefesh light, meaning the soul and the soul energy, the soul light. So he's going back to the example, like the sheath. The nartik is like the sheath, is like the encasing that encases the sun. The sun has a membrane that surrounds it. It's called nartik hashemesh. Shayodei nimshach ha'er l'hoyer esa'elam. This is the pasuk, shemesh u'mogen Hashem elikim. Shemesh u'mogen. And mogen is like its shield or its sheath. The shemesh u'mogen is like Hashem and elikim. It's like, so the shemesh, because it's such a powerful light, for it to be able to shine, obviously it needs to travel the millions of miles and it gets diminished. But the first state of diminishment is the nartik, is the sheet that's so-called encasing. It isn't true, it is a transparent encasing, obviously, but it's still a nartik. In other words, for example, it says, La'asad Lavi, Mashiach comes, Meitzi Shemesh min Ateka. The sun will be removed from its case. So it will be shining with a lot more power. So basically, the nartik he's comparing here to the Parsa. So it serves as a filter, a type of curtain, a partition, however you translate it. So through it, nimshach the Ohr, to radiate and illuminate the world, meaning earth. The Kamoshu called be'etzem hashemesh, going back to the example he gave before. The way the Ohr is encompassed in the etzem, in the core sun, meaning not as it shines out through the nartik, through the sheath. So then, Ein Bechinas Mitzias Ohr canal. It's not yet Ohr. The Ohr is completely bottled and completely absorbed within its source. Like he brought from Shai Yichud V'Amunah, chapter 3. V'ayidei hanartik, it's through the sheath of the sun, Nas b'mitzias Ohr l'hoyer. that diffuses it enough. It's still extremely intense light and heat, but it diffuses it enough to become a CSR that's now not so called overwhelmed and completely nullified in the presence of its source. I don't know if he's going to use an example, but think of the difference between a teacher and a student. The student has become a teacher, but when he's in the presence of his teacher, he's not going to say anything because he's completely nullified by his teacher, completely stays silent. But when the teacher moves away, or the student moves away, I should say even better, meaning he goes outside of the sphere, the domain of the sun, of the mashpia, then he becomes a light of his own. It's still the light of the sun, but you see an independent element that is here that is allowing the light to become a substance outside of the sun, which can then travel and be diminished and ultimately reach and illuminate the earth. So that's what the Nartik accomplishes. It takes an Ohr, which was initially only the power of the sun to reveal itself, or Lamaila, we'll soon learn, Atzilus power to reveal himself, and turns it into an actual revelation, an actual Ohr that's now Metzius. So the Parsa is essentially that filter or that partition that creates that shift, that paradigm shift. So now that's the moshel. And what's the nimshal, the moral? Kamoi kain hu ba'Ohr Eliki. Same is with the Ohr Eliki, the divine energy, shenasa mokeh le'elamis, that becomes a source for the world. So the Ohr has now manifests itself in a way that is becoming a source. Not like the Ohr that is encompassed in the core, that's not yet called a source because it's removed. So hu al yedei haparsa mafsekes. It's through the separating partition. Okay, here he says it explicitly. This is the partition between Atzilus and Biy'a, Yetzirah, and Asiya. The Atzilus, Shama bitl di Yichud law. In Atzilus, there's a bitl of Yichud law. Like we said, what's Yichud law? Das in the Ohr, encompassed in its source, and it's completely nullified. Kula kamei kala, the law with an aleph, chashiv. The lechenik Atzilus elam ha'achdus. That's why Atzilus is called the world of unity. Shakol botlam miyuchad be'ein sof ha'maitzel, because everything there is nullified, is sublimated, and united, miyuchad, one with the infinite divine light of the maitzel, of the emanator. What dominates in Atzilus? The emanator. Yes, there are 10 spheres, but the 10 spheres are simply expressions of the source. Because relatively speaking, there, relative to Biy'a, there is the Ohr, the way it's encompassed in its source. So it's true, it's not Ohr Kol Batz Musay before the Tzimtzum Arishin, like Atzilus the Klolos, but in the microcosm, relatively speaking, it's like Ohr Kol Batz Musay. I'm going to stop in a moment. I'll read one more line. Like it says elsewhere, Be'inyan atu Hashem levadecha, that you are God alone. You Hashem levadecha, you alone. What is that referring to? Davayu b'chinas Atzilus. Because it says atu Hashem. The Hashem Havaya is the level of Atzilus. V'harizeh dayin levadecha b'chinas hu levadehu. So in other words, Havaya ata is referring to the source. Hashem levadecha, that's Atzilus, but it's still in a state of levadecha, meaning apart from anything. Hu levadehu. What it feels in Atzilus is there's only God. There's nothing else. It's a structure, but the structure is completely permeated and completely saturated with the divine awareness and consciousness. There's no separate identity. That's why we say Iyu v'chayu ichad, Iyu v'garmu ichad, the ovis amarkova. Everything there is just a vehicle for divine expression. So in this context, that's Yichud law. I'll stop here before we continue. If any questions, because now comes, I see also, not a short parentheses. Any questions?
What is he adding here specifically that's new? A lot of this seems, I don't know, not new, frankly. I don't mean to be.
It's all new, frankly, but I'm not sure what you mean. It's not new. What do you mean it's not new? That Yichud law is Atzilus? That's not new. What's new here is that he's explaining the whole idea of Shema and Baruch Shem, and he's explaining it at length for us to be able to then take these ideas and apply it to what he's going to discuss.
That much I get.
So this is context. If he didn't say this, we'd be missing the whole connection to Yichud Elah, Yichud Tata. So he's explaining. I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by new. There's no problem saying that this says elsewhere too, and we've learned these ideas before.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
But he's tying it all together. Remember, the whole thing began on page 1466. He asked a few questions about how you affect the Nefesh Abamis. So he said to get there, Yesh lahagdim tchila inyan akrishma, Parsa Shena, which is Shema and Baruch Shem, that leads to Vahafta. So he's now coming, and after explaining at length Yesh Ma'ayin, Yesh Miyesh, and so on, he's coming back and now explaining these levels of unity. So then he can go back to Vahafta. That's the context, as I'm sure you're aware.
I hear you. So, okay. I don't want to
let's put it this way.
Thank you.
You take out this whole piece and you won't have a flow. I mean, if you wrote it, what would you write next? You know?
I might assume the reader understood everything. Well, 95% of this, what you just read in this paragraph, he's already said. I would assume the reader knows it, and I would make my point. But whatever, it's a writing style. I don't mean to disrupt the class.
Yeah, well, it's critical because it's the bridge to the continuation of this discussion. No, you can't just say stop with this and then say, like when he started B'chol Hanal Yuvan Ayin Beis Yichudim. So I would also challenge you to find where exactly he explained the two Yichudim. He did explain it earlier, but not recently. He definitely explained it, but not in this context, for sure not. Okay.
Yeah, it really helped me when he mentioned that it's Atzilus. I mean, it really helped me.
Well, that's one aspect of it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Any other questions?
I have a question, and I'm sure you're going to tell me I'm getting ahead of myself. But the first pasuk of Shema is Yichud Ilah, and the second pasuk Baruch Shem Kavod is Yichud Tata. So is that Yichud Tata beginning with the Dafka, this interface between, let's say, Malchus of Atzilus and Biy'a, or is it after the Parsa? Is it only in Biy'a?
Well, essentially what he's saying here, to go from Atzilus to Biy'a, which means from Yichud Ilah to Yichud Atah, that's the Parsa.
Okay.
That's what he's saying. That Atzilus is Yichud Ilah. Just bear in mind that in Shema itself, there's also Yichud Ilah, Yichud Atah. Hashem Elokeinu and Hashem Echad are also Yichud Ilah.
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Additionally, let me make one more point. Ayin Beis and Chassidus in general is not an academic work. It's an Avodah work. It's all about Avodah. It's all about bringing this into your personal life and application. So when I read a line in the Maimer, in this Maimer, any Maimer, the point of the line is not just to explain an idea, it's to give us tools to transform ourselves. Like in this case, Ayin Beis' interface. So I frankly would love the Rebbe Rashab to repeat himself a lot more. I don't find him repeating himself at all, if you really ask me. Because anything we've learned before about this, I have to tell you, and I'm not saying this to pull rank, when I read it, I see a lot of new things. And though I've learned Ayin Beis before, and I know exactly where he spoke about this earlier in volume 2 and volume 1, but I see a lot of new things here, just for the record. So if you really want to compare, I would suggest go find where you saw this earlier and see if you don't see any change, any additions here. You will see there are additions, just in addition to everything else I said. Yeah.
Thank you.
This might be off the topic, but at the end of Yom Kippur, when he said Hashem Elokim, does that relate to? I mean, what does that mean to us? What should we think of at that time?
Well, there's a lot of translations and meanings of Hashem Elokim. It definitely fits into Yichud Ilah and Yichud Tata. Remember, there we say Shema, Baruch Shem, and then Hashem Elokim. And we say once, 3 times, and 7 times. So there are different explanations. Shema, sometimes Yichud Ilah, Baruch Shem, Yichud Tata. And Hashem Elokim is bringing it into Sevav Kalam and Mamala Kalam 7 times through all the 7 heavens, through all the 7 spheres, the 7 midas, and so on. But Hashem Elokim itself, like we learned, V'yadaita Hayoim V'shavesa Levecha Ki Havaya Hu Elokim. Literally a posuk that is talking about Havaya, the divine transcendent, is one with the divine, that immanent. Similar to what he's saying here, that Havaya Elokim can be also understood as Yichud Elah, Yichud Tata. But there are other explanations as well. It all comes down to where you're at and what you're learning, You could apply this to that, what we say Yom Kippur. Absolutely.
Not to get sidetracked. Sorry, go ahead, Rabbi Gold.
Rabbi Jacobson, the explanation of in Shema itself, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, is Yichud Elah and Yichud Tata. I was looking for that. Was that your addition, or is that specifically stated by the Rebbe in Ayin Beis that within Shema itself?
It's stated explicitly twice. Once on page 1466.
1466.
Okay.
Yep.
Closer to the bottom of the page.
Okay.
You see it? You can look it up. You'll see it there.
But okay.
Protius, 4 lines from the bottom of the page.
Okay.
And then briefly it's stated again, the first line on the paragraph, the middle paragraph on page 1472.
1472. Okay. And my question again, the follow-up question on that is that Hashem Elokeinu within Shema, is that, I'm trying to figure out, is that Zah and Malchus within Atzilus, Hashem Elokeinu, and then Hashem Echad is from Malchus into Biy'a, or is Hashem Elokeinu is coming in from Atzilus into Biy'a, and Hashem Echad is a Malchus of Asiya, Malchus of Asiya into Malchus of Asiya.
If you read 3 lines from the bottom of page 1466, he spells it out.
Oh, he does. Okay. All right.
He says, Hashem Elokeinu is Yichud Avah, the Yichud of Chachma and Bina, and Hashem Echad is the Yichud of Zah and Malchus.
Within Atzilus, obviously. Within Atzilus.
Yeah.
I hear you, Reb Simon, but I cannot see you. Is this only me?
As the others, I don't know.
Yeah. I see you and hear you just fine, Rabbi Jacobson.
Okay, so it's probably you, Shlomi. You have to. I don't know why.
Okay. Thank you.
When the Rebbe says that Abba and Malchus, is that to exclude any other interpretation? Like this is exclusively understanding that, or could
Nothing
it also
excludes any other interpretation, but this is the interpretation he's explaining here. Nothing excludes anything. There's a lot of interpretations on almost anything in Chassidus that you'll find more than one explanation. But this is what he's using here. This is the explanation here.
Interesting. Because for me, that was a real chiddush. I always knew if Yichud Elah was Shema and Baruch Shem was Yichud Tata, and then within Shema itself, you have both Yichudim. That was a chiddush to me. So that was very.
Yes, I'm sure you won't be shocked that you'll probably hear other chiddushim too in Chassidus. Right?
Okay. Yeah, sure. But I just letting you know that was
okay.
Fine. Affected my.
I learned it.
My Shema. It's affected since I heard that. It's affected my recitation of Shema. My davening.
I'm glad to hear that. That's good. That's good.
I
will tell you this piece in Ayin Beis is taken straight from the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. So he's literally quoting Mittler Rebbe on this. Not that it changes anything. I'm just pointing that out.
I learned just real quick. I learned a new taich on Hashem Elokim. Learning yesterday with my rabbi, learning the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. He was learning something of the Rebbe, the most recent Rebbe, and he said there's a different taich, but the Rebbe taich Hashem Elokim That is to say, the Shem Havaya is the Shem Elokim relative to Atzmus. So so in other words, above transcendent, you have Atzmus, which is beyond anything. I thought that was a beautiful taich.
Okay.
If that made sense. I'm sure Rabbi Jacobson probably knows what I'm referring to.
I do, but I don't mix it here because I don't want to confuse matters. But there are absolutely many interpretations. Some of them are different and some are reconcilable and are connected. Just be aware of that. That's for sure the case.
But how could Hashem, Yitzhak, Hashem Elokeinu and Shema, how could Hashem be Atzmas? Hashem is not a name for Atzmas.
Let's discuss this later. Let's take that offline.
All right.
It's not Ayin Beis, so let's continue here.
Maybe after he turns off the recording, Eliezer.
Okay. Now we're up to, so we define Atzilus as Yichud Elah. So clearly he's talking here about Shema and Baruch Shem, because if you're talking about Yichud, the Abba Ve'ima, and Yichud Zun, that's both in Atzilus. And there he says Zun was Yichud Tata. But here clearly speaking, Atzilus is Yichud Elah, and the Parsa is the partition, and there it goes over to the second level of Ohr, Yichud Tata, Baruch Shem in Biy'a. But before he gets back to Biy'a, there's going to be a relatively long parenthesis. It looks like around 15 lines. To be exact, 16 lines.
Right for oil.
A parenthesis that is going to explain a little more about Atzilus and Yichud Elah. And then after the parentheses, he's going to go back. Aval Biy'a hem bechinas yesh. So just keep in mind, I'll do the parentheses now. I'm not going to skip it. I'll do the parentheses, but keep in mind that after the parentheses, we go back to the second, because he just spoke about Atzilus, which is the first part, the Achdus of Yichud Elah. Then comes the Parsa, and then comes Biy'a. But Biy'a is going to be addressed after the parentheses. So we're going to talk now, we're going to go through the parentheses. Someone wanted to say something?
It cannot be a parsa between oil hakolol be'atzmusei, right? Only between oil that is kiru v'layesh.
I don't know what you mean. He's saying here the parsa is between Ohr HaKol B'atzmusei and the Ohr that's kiru v'layesh, the two levels of Ohr. That's the parsa. Ohr HaKol B'atzmusei is the level of Yichud Elah of Atzilus, as he's defining right here. Then comes a parsa, and there's the Ohr that's kiru v'layesh. The parsa is between these two levels of Ohr that he's been discussing at length, the last page.
So I understood it wrong. I thought the parsa is between her oil, kiru v'layesh, and the yesh.
No. Read inside, you'll see. It's like the Ohr kol in the sun, and the nartik, the sheath, is in between to the Ohr that's outside of the sun. Okay. So now comes the parentheses. So he says like this. V'agam da Atzilus, you're saying that Atzilus is Yichud Elah, and you're comparing it to Ohr Kol B'atzmusei. So there's an obvious question that comes up. And he's not asking it, he's saying Hagam, he's qualifying. The Hagam da Atzilus u'b'chinas ha'yetziya v'izgalus chutz la'atzmusei. We know Atzilus, the very definition of Atzilus means it's emanated, meaning it's emanated from the Maitzil. The Maitzil is the emanator, and Atzilus is the emanation. It's true, it's not a creation in the literal sense of the word, because it's not yesh mayin, it's a revelation of the divine faculties or divine attributes. But it's still chutz yitziv is galus chutz la'atzmusei. So why are we saying that it's like Ohr HaKol B'atzmusei? So he's answering, Hine, Kol Zeh K'moshu B'atzmusei Adayin. That even the Yetziv is Galus, Chutz L'Atzmusei, is still, relatively speaking, in the Etzem itself, there are levels. In other words, there's a level that's higher than Atzilus, obviously. We know that. There's higher worlds than Atzilus, and there's all the way before the Tzimtzum, actually. However, relatively speaking, Biy'a is already chutz la'atzmusei because it's like speaking, and a yeshem mitzi is a dependent entity, and Atzilus because it's not independent and it's completely saturated and permeated with godliness. So, relatively speaking, Kav Yochel, he calls it in Atzmusei itself, even though it's a sea of his galus, it's all within Atzmusei itself. And he's going to explain it now with the macrocosm. So I hope this doesn't confuse anyone, but let's just go back. Remember, Atzilus, like all the worlds, our macrocosm is the ways before the Tzimtzum is Atzilus the Klolus, and Atzilus the Pratis is after the Tzimtzum, but relative to Biy'a, it's called Atzilus. So, relative to lower levels, it's called Atzilus. And then Biy'a is the Biy'a the Pratis. So he's now going to compare the microcosm to the macrocosm. This is not always, as I said, when Chassidus talks Atzilus, it usually means in microcosm, like in the context of Atzilus and beyond the Parsa. But when then Chassidus sometimes will address Atzilus the Klolos is like the Ohr Encompassed, the 10 hidden spheres before the Tzimtzum, and the Tzimtzum comes and Ak Adam Kadman is then Biy'a the Klolos, is the macrocosmic Biy'a. And then Yetzirah the Klolos, as I mentioned a number of times, this is from a mimer of the Alter Rebbe called Drush Gimel Minei Adam. Yetzirah the Klolos is either Akudim and Akudim, or Atik and Arich. And then Asiyah the Klolos is Atzilus Biy'a Yetzirah Asiyah the Pratis, of microcosm. So it's macrocosm, microcosm here. So he's saying now he's going to compare Atzilus the Pratis, since it's called Atzilus, so it has something in common with Atzilus the Klolos, of macrocosm. And what does it have in common? That it's like Kolol Batzmusei relative to Biy'a. That's what he's going to explain now. So he says like this: Ukamay Atzilus the Klolos, like it is with the macrocosmic Atzilus. Shazeu b'chinas hispashtus the Erein Sof Shalifnei Atzimtzum. What is Atzilus the Klolos? That's the extension of divine energy, but all Lifnei Atzimtzum. You know, it's in God's so-called consciousness, if you wish, the lack of a better word, the divine consciousness before the Tzimtzum, where there is no existence altogether. So God revealed to us that he also created a process, because as I said, he doesn't need the process, but he wants us to understand him and wants us to retrace the steps. So the process is that there's the Ohr that is first within himself, to himself, and then there's this Pashtus Ohr, and that's Atzilus the Klolos. Ukamoshin is bar le'il, like we learned earlier, like it was explained earlier, the Ba'agili the Erein Sof Shalifnei Tzimtzum, that the revelation of the infinite divine light before the Tzimtzum, Yesh Beis Madregas. There are two levels. B'chinas ha'er ha'meir la'atzmei, the energy as it radiates to himself, like example would be thought, in contrast to speech. Va'beis mashameir ba'atzmei, that also radiates within himself, but it's b'chinas ha'er ha'shayach le'elemes. Within his own consciousness, he's beginning to think about existence. But it's all within the mashpia, it's all within the makir, it's all within the Erein Sof before the tzimtzum. So it's all within himself. So you could be concentrating, just to use an example, on yourself, or you could be thinking about another, but it's all within your being, within your own very essence. So these are two levels before the tzimtzum. So one is called Etzem Ohr and one is called Hispashtus Ohr, the core energy, which is just shining. This is expressing himself, and the second to himself, and the second is relating to, in his own inner psyche, to the other, to existence. Both of them are all within himself. It's not yet actually extended. It's all within himself. So then why is it called Atzilus the Klolos? Because within himself, there's a difference between when the light is just the light that relates to himself, or a light that he's beginning to relate to, or is relating to another. Because within his own core, is now radiating a light that relates to existence. That's why it's the level called Atzilus in macrocosm. So we see from Atzilus the Klolos that even Atzilus itself, though it is so-called chutz, it's not really chutz. It's all within himself, but how he's thinking within himself about the other. In this case, existence. And why is it called Atzilus? So he says, "V'nikra zeh b'shem Atzilus." This level is called with the name Atzilus. Remember, Atzilus comes from the word, from the expression Parsa ba'aleischa, when Moshe said, "Ayin li basar," where do I have meat? So Hashem said, "Vayetzel min haruach," I will impart from your spirit upon the Zkenim, and that's the source in Psukim about Atzilus. And the Zohar explains what that refers to, Atzilus. So what's that? Why is it called Atzilus? Because they're there, like in the story with Moshe, it's not Moshe any longer. It's the 70 Zkenim. It's the 70 sages. They're not Moshe, but yet Moshe's spirit was imparted to them. So on one hand, it's nothing outside of it. It's not really outside of Moshe, but it is outside of him. His spirit has imparted to another entity. So that's why it's called Atzilus. So he says, his galus chutz latzmusei, meaning it's not the Ohr as it is to himself. As he explains. Chutz latzmusei doesn't mean outside of the source. It means in the source itself, it's what he's envisioning or he's relating to what is necessary, the Ohr that will be needed for the Elamus to create the worlds. So it's called Chutz Latzmusei, even though it's still really encompassed within the Etzem. So essentially, he's going into a very subtle understanding that in the Etzem itself, you could have two levels. The Etzem as it relates to itself, the Ohr that relates to itself, and the Ohr as it relates to another, but all still within the person. Like I said before, with a human being is also, you have machshava, you could think. Your thoughts are about how you understand something. And then in your thoughts, you could think about how am I going to convey that to someone else? Or how do I relate to someone else? But it's all within you. And for all practical purposes, an outsider would never know these two levels of thought because it's all within yourself. So this is all being used to understand. So the same will be said about Atzilus the Proteus. Soon get back to that. In microcosm, the same idea. Compared to Biy'a, Atzilus the Proteus is also an internal type of energy. However, it's an energy that's beginning to relate to existence, but it's all within that. Any questions before I continue here? And maybe I will stop here. We still have plenty to go in this parenthesis. It's not a short parenthesis. Any questions?
My question is that two madregas, Ohr who meir moker loilames. I think that there is a higher madrega than the Ohr k'fi shehu meir la'atzmo, which is Ohr k'fi shehu ba'atzmusai. I'm correct?
Yeah, but he's not discussing it here.
I know, but I want to know. There is such a thing, right?
There's many levels, but again, he's only discussing these two levels.
No, not many levels. If you're talking about the Etzem and the Ohr, there are three levels.
There are levels where there's no Ohr altogether. There's Helama Atzmi. There's the Ohr that's not even Nikra Ohr B'chlal. There are levels. Yes, there are.
And this is part of Ohr. The Helama Atzmi is part of Ohr or Atzmi?
No, but I don't want to discuss it because the Rebbe Rashab is not discussing it. That's exactly why I'm saying he's not discussing it. Why is it relevant?
Because I don't know it.
Not relevant to discussion here. It'll just confuse matters right now, in my opinion.
But could you say it just in a short yes or no?
I said, yes, there are levels higher.
Thank you.
And any other questions? I'm going to stop here because we need a little more time to process, and I don't want to read it quickly, the next lines, because he's spelling it out a bit more, which frankly is very, really encouraging, I should say. because this helps connect a lot of the dots of previous themes that were discussed earlier in this volume and previous volumes, as I shall explain as we learn on. Okay. Let me just say one more thing before we conclude here. These levels are not just academic discussion. Each level here is critical in understanding the interface between existence and the divine, as you can imagine, and as I've explained many, many times. So this dissecting of levels is not just splitting hairs. It's not about splitting hairs here. It's understanding, as we've talked about, there's the divine as the shines, the divine on God's terms, and then you have the divine as it relates to our terms. Essentially, Yichud Ilah, Yichud Tata, Das Ayin and Das Tacht. So understanding this, both in Atzilus, the Proteus and microcosm, and understanding it in Atzilus, the Klolos, helps us ultimately climb the ladder and connect and reconnect all these levels. That's really ultimately the goal here. The Yichud of Yichud Ilah, Yichud Tata. Unity between Das Ayin and Das Tacht, like he says, even though they're two different perspectives, you really want them to join as one. And this is all part of the contemplation of Shema and Baruch Shem that will help us bring the animal soul to love God, which is ultimately where this is going, and ultimately the total interface. So when you speak about these two levels, that's why I'm emphasizing these two levels. It's critical to understand them as such. We did discuss, as Reb Shlomo just mentioned, higher levels. There are higher levels. And there's Helam Atzmi and Einoid and Atzmus itself, and so on. But for this part of the discussion, to really understand how existence and the divine join, ultimately, and interface, it's critical to understand these two levels. And that's part of this parenthesis, helping us connect it both in the microcosm and also in the macrocosm as it is before the Tzimtzum. So ultimately, translating this in Aveda is the key, how to personalize it and apply it to our lives. But that we'll talk about as we continue learning. But I will stop here, middle of the parentheses, the middle of page 1473. Any other questions before I conclude here?
When you say Atzilus to close, so you're talking about part of the 10 hidden spheres. So that's what it is. It's part of that group, or is it something else?
Did you say that's the sphere of What did you just say?
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's what he said.
That's the next lines. That's where we'll learn tomorrow. That's the next lines. He talks about the 10 hidden spheres. He's going to talk about it. Generally speaking, the 10 hidden spheres, Atzilus the Klolos. Before the Tzimtzum. When the 10 hidden spheres are spoken about before the Tzimtzum, it's God envisioning. So it's generally Atzilus the Klolos. It says in the next line, if you read it 2 lines further, you'll see.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll learn it tomorrow more in detail. That's why I didn't want to jump there right now, because it needs more explanation.